Our guest today is Louis Dupré. You received a BA in Classics at Louvain, the great European university in Belgium. You went on and stayed there and received your PhD, and then did postgraduate work at Louvain in Catholic theology. You're the author of some 15 books, including 2 highly acclaimed cultural histories, Passage to Modernity, an essay on the hermeneutics of nature and culture, and the Enlightenment and the intellectual development of modern culture. That really are a complete overview of the cultural development of the Western world. Before that, you wrote Marx's Social Critique of Culture, and you're currently at work on a book called Romanticism, The Unfinished Revolution. In addition to your 7 honorary doctorates, you're a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a fellow of the Belgian Academy of Arts and Sciences. Louis Dupré, I want to welcome you to Darwin Cafe.
Thank you.
You have spent a life in the Academy as a devout Roman Catholic, writing about, first specializing in 19th century philosophy. And what's a nice Roman Catholic man doing writing about Marx?
Well, this was done, or at least started at a time when Marxism was not just an interest in Western Europe, but a very hot item and a threatening item. This was the years it started in the late 40s, and we were afraid that there would be a world war. So I wanted to be ahead of that and learn what it would all be about. Later I did it, I continued doing it because I was interested in it. And finally it made me switch to the study of religion. At the time I was teaching at Georgetown University, I immigrated, and that's when I wrote my big book, The Other Dimension, which was a study of religion, because Marxism intrigued me by its total absence of any kind of transcendence. There was plenty of talk about self-transcending man. There's some sort of Promethean view of transcendence, but of real transcendence, nothing. So I wanted to investigate that and see in terms of a true humanism, such as I found in Marx, what that would be like. And then I came up with the idea that somehow in the late Middle Ages, our thinking in the West had taken a completely different turn, that there was almost like a break. And that happened before the Renaissance. It happened at the end of the Middle Ages. And to be more specific, but I should not go into this because it's too complicated, I think, but in the nominalist philosophy and theology of the end of the Middle Ages, William Ockham and others. Because at that point, it was no longer taken for granted that being, as it is, as we have it in front of us, or within us, is really the ultimate truth. Is really what it is supposed to be. What I mean is, in both the classical pagan philosophy and in the medieval Christian philosophy, as far as St. Thomas, for example, we always have the idea that somehow nature is intelligible in itself. You get what you think you are getting. That changed with nominalism, because in nominalism, God's omnipotence in that strange philosophy is so exaggerated, so much stressed unilaterally, that anything can be the case, anything can happen. God can redeem the sinner who died without repentance, and he can reject the justified person. That kind of theory makes the whole system in which people had believed and then until then shaky.
Well, let's suspend that for a minute and come back to it, because let's look at the origins of our culture and those intertwining roots of the Greeks from whom we get our philosophy, and the Judeo-Christians groups
Right.
from whom we get our religion. What did they give us, and how did those two traditions come together, and what was it?
Yes.
What do they have to say to us about life, in nature, in culture, and in God?
Okay, in the Greek tradition, the Greek classical tradition then, nature is the supporting element of the whole thing, called cosmos or physis, whatever. But that is the ultimate reality, and it is also the reality that appears to us. Now, in Christianity, the weight is no longer on nature, but on the Creator, on God. Yet the difference there is not as great for culture as the later difference, and as the modern idea of culture. Why not? Because what for the classicists were, or rather for the classics, was nature as ultimate reality, became for Christians God, the Creator. We could trust nature, we could trust the Creator. There was a continuity there. There was it has been repeatedly stated lately by philosophers that the difference was not all that great in the worldview. Whereas at the end of the Middle Ages, that whole thing was up for grabs. And people say now, what is really true? What is not true? The whole doubt of Descartes is really born out of the questions about nature, about the reliability of nature.
So ancient and medieval man saw nature as an ordered whole, continuous
Correct.
with the divine,
Exactly.
and as a representation or display of the divine. They spelled their word for the appearing world, cosmos, with a K.
Yes.
And they saw in this a mirror of even the human structure, and the whole world structure. Man was embedded in it, as were all creatures, in an orderly whole that was essentially about the process of human salvation.
That's right.
And then the High Middle Ages, the period beginning first with what's sometimes called the medieval Renaissance in the 12th century, with this new explosion of devotional mysticism that came from people like Bernard de Clairvaux and St. Francis, and the monastic movement kind of spilling out of its kind of medieval enclosures and moving into the public, inflamed, did it not, a great popular spirituality?
Yes.
And especially throughout the Rhineland and the Netherlands and northern Italy and France. And then there was in the scholastic movement, we have a negative view of scholasticism, but in the scholastic movement there were a variety of great intellectual and spiritual figures. It was at a day when the academic world was not really so separated off from the lay public and the practicing.
Quite correct what you said. There was a unity there, because there was a unity in worldview. Now there's one other point that you brought up and that deserves emphasis. Namely this, that in the 12th century that there was already a Renaissance. What does that mean? That in the 12th century we see very clearly a new humanism coming up. There was a very short period in the 8th, 9th century when that happened also, but the real revival of humanism, or beginning of humanism, was in the 12th century. There is first, not Renaissance I would say, but the humanism. That people started emphasizing more this life, the beauty of this life, of this world, instead of talking too exclusively of a meaning and of a reality after this life. This life had all the emphasis. Now, that element...
But it wasn't the same thing as mere worldliness, was it?
Yes, what?
It wasn't just mere worldliness. It wasn't just life for the sake of the pleasures of this life,
Yes.
nevertheless.
Absolutely. The pleasure itself was part of it. that element also, I refer to the negative element of nominalism, that there is another element that is at the beginning of modern culture, namely this, to believe in nature, to believe in this life, to believe in humanism, to believe in man. And eventually, in the Renaissance, and that's where it will change somewhat, and particularly in the Enlightenment, what we see at that point is that the element, the naturalist element, the humanist element, turns into a creative element. In other words, that was the fact that the person is the creator of all meaning. That was something that was not there in the early Middle Ages. Although, if we read Dante, we will find very strange things. For example, he says this at one point in one of his prose writings: I can do as a poet what God does, in this sense that God creates from nothing. And when I come up with a metaphor, it means a poem, I come up with something that is created from nothing. In other words, the creativity, the element of creativity is already there in nucleo, a little bit. And that will be developed very much in a later time, the 17th century, 16th, 17th century. Let us take the philosophy of Descartes. Descartes will say, I question everything. I question even, methodically, the existence of God. So, where shall I find the ground of certainty? And the answer is, within myself, within my own mind. Artists, the great artists of the Renaissance, were so great because they had an idea of absolute unlimited creativity. Take Michelangelo, for example. He was in so many fields. He was actually a very great painter, an even greater sculptor, but also a poet, and also a deeply religious person. Because this first creativity, but particularly in the humanists and the Renaissance painters, this first creativity is a religious creativity. These people were creators under God, so to speak. They owed their own, Dante is very explicit on that, they owed their own creativity to a higher creator. So even though they were the creators in this world, their creativity itself was a gift of God.
Louis, you were mentioning earlier William of Ockham and nominalism as a kind of a transitional influence in the late Middle Ages that sort of set the stage for
the negative stage.
The negative stage for Renaissance doubt over against this other stage of creativity, which you mentioned is epitomized by Dante, and I remember you talking about Giordano Bruno and Nicholas of Cusa, who were all part of that, all enjoyed that medieval sensus spiritualis, that sense that all learning looks for and presumes a spiritual meaning or sense in all things. What is nominalism, and why did it have such a pernicious effect on culture?
Well, I should not do that. I should not be pernicious, because after all, nominalism is the basic philosophy that made it possible for modern science to develop. What these people said is this: you cannot take anything for granted. You cannot take it for granted that the truth is given by God, that except in the revelation. But for the rest, you should not take anything for granted. You should, by experience, by observation, by empirical methods, find out the reality of the world. And that doesn't give you an ultimate reality, but it gives you a world in which we actually live. And all of this is a result, strangely enough, a result of a theological idea of the absolute omnipotence of God. Anything can happen. He can do anything he wants to. We cannot rely on that. We have no access to a divine intelligence. We should not say, by way of analogy, as St. Thomas does, that from the things of this world we can learn a great deal about God. That is not in nominalism.
So human access to the divine through the realm of the play of your relations, the natural world, the social world that you're in, no longer is a field of really of divine revelation, a bridge, you might say,
Yes.
to
That's right.
God. What does that do to the human psyche?
Well, it means that the whole thing is split. On the one hand, we have our observational world. We have our world in which we better be creative because we cannot take it for granted.
You-
Even in Kepler, as late as Kepler, we still have this presumption that things in a divinely created world have to be perfect. For example, no oval or irregular shapes, but circles. It had to be in circles, and he found out that there wasn't, to his great surprise, because as a deeply religious person, sort of a mystical type, Kepler, he found out by his observations and calculations that this is not the way it was, actually. In other words, that there is a discrepancy here between this world that we observe, what we think of, what we measure, what we observe, and the world that is beyond that world, and to which this world owes its origin. But it is not an analogy. The analogy is not something that they can be trusted. I enormously simplify this.
But in the medieval time, there was this sense of, like, for example, the doctrine of correspondences, whereby a plant's particular qualities mirrored something about the balance between the divine
Yes.
forces, divine beings, and so
Yes.
on, and were discovered in biology or then magic and so on. That the doctrine was then turned into, with Cartesian logic,
Yes.
with this idea that man only knew his own subjective consciousness, and whatever the world display, being like coming from William of Ockham, could just be an arbitrary display created by God, an evil genius even.
Yes,
Could create it.
absolutely. Evil genius is a typically nominalistic idea. Huh? But the difference means this also, that in the Middle Ages, you have an infinite realm of symbolism. Everything has a symbolic meaning. That is, of course, no longer true. This is also why in the modern age, mostly but not exclusively with the Reformation, came the idea of that it was necessary to have a literal reading of the Bible and not this kind of wild symbolism of the Middle Ages. They say now also in Thomas says the fundamental meaning is the literal one, but beyond that there is a symbolic meaning, a spiritual meaning as they call it, and that idea is no longer valid as such. There will still be spiritual masters who will continue that. In fact, in spiritual life, in spiritual writers, there is a much less abrupt transition between the modern age and the Middle Ages.
Who are the ones you think make the bridge between the medieval and the modern time?
Oh, for one thing, the one you mentioned already, Nicholas of Cusa, who is a sort of a mystical writer, but at the same time a totally modern person. Great mathematician, a great observer, and a great philosopher. But at the same time, he also is not afraid of going into the mystical meaning of things, the symbolic meaning of things.
And these mystical, symbolic meanings connected people up to the cosmos, their fellow men, and the divine?
Yes, very much. In fact, he says very explicitly that man is also a god, except for the fact that he is finite. In other words, that his perfection is the same as the divine perfection. It is the same, not like, but identical. But there is this difference, that he has it only in a limited way. In other words, that there are other human beings, and thereby they limit one another.
What did we lose then, and what did we gain in the Renaissance?
Oh, that is a question I wouldn't be able to answer because, number one, the liberation of human creativity is an enormous gain, I think. And look at the beautiful world it has created in Renaissance art, poetry also. French poetry, for example, was never more beautiful perhaps than in the Renaissance. With Joaquin du Bellay, Ronsard, and so these are all great poets. The Italian poetry, not only Dante, of course, but Petrarca, Tasso, and all the way up to the 19th century. Let us face it, the development of modern science became possible only at the end of the Middle Ages. And now here I would say, not with the Renaissance, but at the end of the Middle Ages, because the people who became active in this were actually quite often theologians. Theologians of observation. We have to go back to observing, calculating and observing, but not take it for granted anymore. So that is certainly a great advantage. What did we lose? Well, I think the main loss is the notion of symbolism. Now you will say that's not a big deal, but it is. Because that meant also that in this world we are masters. There's only us. We can create. We create any darn thing we want to, and we handle the world in any way we want to. So many of the miseries that we now have with us are also a result of that.
Because it creates an instrumentalist, manipulative,
Very
reductive
Exactly.
kind of energy in relationship to the natural world rather than a respectful one.
This is our world, and we are the creators.
And so, and we're the dominant ones as the creative.
They
people.
will not deny, until very recent writers, but writers in general did not deny the fact that there was a divine cause to this all. But the question was that this cause has nothing to do in this world with us. Here we have to take care of ourselves. And we have to, particularly, we have to create the meaning of this world to ourselves. The difference is not only very visible in theology, but and in philosophy, particularly in philosophy, but also even in poetry. The modern poetry is essentially different from medieval poetry. Now, it is difficult to define when they started because these things all proceeded very gradually. In that sense, you can say Petrarca is the first modern poet. But we are in full Middle Ages still. And he was considered 100 years later as a medieval man. But I would think that the modern age begins in that late medieval period, 14th century.
So modern man feels himself more isolated, more in charge,
Yes.
not so dependent upon the vagaries of a potentially capricious God,
Right.
which makes him feel better.
Yes.
But he's also dissociated from his cosmos, which leaves him to feel
Yes.
alienated, alone. Now, it seems that there have been attempts since the Renaissance, one, to reconnect religiously at the collective level. We were mentioning earlier in the High Middle Ages there was this explosion of lay mysticism that was quite serious. There
Yes.
were, for example, the Beguine households in Cologne, some 200 in Cologne, Germany, in the 14th century. And it seems that periodically the popular lay culture has attempted to break out
Yes.
of a kind of bourgeois spirit and enter into sacred practice seriously, but it's been obstructed and threatened in doing so by two forces, sometimes the church and sometimes the state and sometimes both. Is that correct?
Well, it is quite true that there were spiritual forces that tried to reconnect, as you put it. And you also rightly point at these lay congregations, such as the Brothers of the Common Life in the Low Countries. They were actually modern men. I say men because there was no female equivalent for that. But they had been preceded again in the Low Countries by another movement, the movement of the Beguines, who were actually lay women. My residence in Flanders, in Belgium, is right next to a Beguine court. And some years ago there were still 2 Beguines living there. You know, these are lay women. Each one has its own, has her own garden, her own little house. And of course now this is a very well-known tourist center, these things. But it still has kept the mentality. It had its own church. At night the gates are closed, the entrance to the court.
So it's a semi-cloistered life.
Yes.
Mm.
And it produced actually quite early famous poets and writers. For example, the famous Dutch mystic Hadewig was one of these Beguines, or similar movement in any event. But with the Brothers of the Common Life, something new starts. You're quite right. That even though their whole spirituality was fed by the medieval Catholic spirituality, specifically the spirituality of Ruysbroek, nevertheless, and of Eckhart, nevertheless, that spirituality is translated by them into modern forms. And I mean by that, for the brothers, the whole instruction that they gave is penetrated by nominalism and by humanism. So these 2 currents came together in what actually was a new spiritual movement. But I think that much of that reconnection gets, at least in the culture as such, much of that gets lost in the 18th century. Because in the 18th century there had been very serious problems, particularly about the Bible. It was then that the historical science made progress, or sciences made progress, and people realized that some of these stories were very strange. You know, this was supposed to be, both for Protestants and for Catholics, the absolute truth. They had no other supernatural truth than the Bible. Well, and the church which interpreted the Bible. But here we are. I mean, what does that mean, that the world was created on that day, 4,000 years ago?
It was a very busy day.
Yeah. Yes. But that whole, these stories lost, I wouldn't say it lost their meaning completely, but it raised very serious questions. And then you have the interpreters of the Bible. You have Spinoza and Richard Simon, who was a Catholic priest. And Spinoza, of course, was a not Orthodox Jew who was actually rejected by the synagogue for the wrong reason, because what he was accused of, he never said. But the problems of the Bible is one aspect for a further break. Another part is the whole question of morality, and that became really acute in the 20th century. When people started saying, no, look, if man is a creator of his own being, of his own life, of his own meaning, then where does he have, what else is there but laws that he himself creates, or more correctly, the law of his intelligence? And his intelligence is his. People at the end of the 19th century and in the early part of the 20th century, many great thinkers ceased to be Christians because of that point. I'm thinking of 2, the great ethicist at the beginning of this century, end of the 19th, of the 20th century, but at the end of the 19th, Nikolai Hartmann was one of the greatest writers on ethics. He was non-Christian because he says, no, I do not believe in that anymore. And the same with another more recent figure, Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher. It's basically a problem of ethics. He says, what is it to say that I am free if I have to be obedient to something else than myself? In other words, it ruins the very idea of freedom. That is the main reason of the atheism of Sartre also.
So in the previous ancient and medieval time, with an ordered cosmos and with man being a microcosm, a living microcosm of the cosmos, ethics came from a certain, there was a natural law that was based on an actual state of your being. And now in modern times,
which reflected God's own
which reflected
nature.
God's own nature, and there was actually a sense that the divine processes would awaken in the human body mind.
Right.
And that once awakened, say your heart is awakened by God, that you would naturally or inherently be moral because the heart would be moved to act rightly. But in the modern times, with this kind of breaking off of human creativity from its divine root, which is initially with the explosion of creativity in people like Dante and Bruno and others, and Michelangelo, the creative process was still rooted in a spiritual, religious convention. But now that's been eclipsed. Mankind is more alienated, has no actual experience of a divine presence or a sympathetic connectedness, has lost his symbolism of connectedness, and no longer, and all his laws and his culture becomes, in some sense, an arbitrary of conventions rather than a reflection or of an inherent patterning. Is that what you would say?
There were, yes, very much so. There were transitions, however. For example, if we go to the beginning of the 18th century, a transition which became particularly clear in England, in ethics, the ethics of feeling. In other words, an ethics that is grounded no longer in a purely rational law, but in the way in which we feel things. It is the time of what the Germans have called die schöne Seele, the beautiful soul. La belle âme of Rousseau. For example, if you read the novel of Rousseau, Julie, ou La Nouvelle Louise, what you have there is, they set up a very strange marriage arrangement where the former lover is allowed to move in with husband and wife, and this is actually the result of what we feel to be moral. We should follow our heart. Now you say that sounds like a medieval idea, but it isn't, because the heart, in this case the sentimentality or the feeling, is the very essence of my being. My feeling and my being is really the same thing. And you find it earlier, before that, in the English, a very good philosopher and very good writer, Shaftesbury, the third Earl of Shaftesbury, who wrote these, what he called characteristics, and in which he describes very beautifully the morality of feeling. And in a way, that was a reaction against the rationalist philosophy of the 18th century, or of the late 17th century already. And at the same time, it was something that is pretty much the same.
So you're saying that in some sense this cult of sensibility or cult of feeling is because it's a reaction to the kind of Cartesian separation of man from nature and culture and the cosmos, that in some sense it's also a reflection of the very sense of separation. It's still marked by or marred by that very thing it's trying to overcome.
Well, it's certainly, I wouldn't, perhaps you're right, but I have never thought about it. To what extent is it a reaction against Descartes? Only to this extent, I think, that Descartes is at the beginning of the Enlightenment. And the idea of law, which was so strong in the Enlightenment, that is what they react against. That is the law of reason. It's a reason, you know, where is it? And at the same time, there is something very attractive in this morality of feeling, in this sense that most of the time moral people do not ask themselves, what is the law? How often do you do this in one day? I don't think very often, perhaps never. But we say, what is the decent thing to do? What is the elegant thing, as the ancients would say? Eh? The asteon,
The aesthetic was not disconnected from
very
morality
much,
or from divinity.
very much. In that school of the 18th century, their sentimental school of morality, aesthetics and morality go together. And the latest, but also the most brilliant echo of that, we find in the German poet Schiller, in his book on the aesthetic education of mankind. It's really a book about morality, but it's all about aesthetics.
I want to explore that one more in another step, but before we do that, you mentioned the idea of la belle âme, the noble soul. And didn't the great 19th century German philosopher see the noble soul as having a hidden shadow of egoic aggression, imposing its own values still within a structure of conflict within his master-slave dialectic or development, that in some sense it was in the noble soul, has an ironic tinge to it.
Yes, but I think that the irony stands at the opposite end of the beautiful soul. Although Goethe has a long passage in Wilhelm Meister, the famous book that started Romanticism, and in that book there is the most famous passage perhaps is the one on the beautiful soul, which is a very beautiful passage, but is also written with a certain irony. In other words, the two, you feel all the time he is above this. He wants to go back to something more solid than that. So I would say that the beautiful soul is indeed a manifestation of the autonomy of the person, in this sense that I have to go by my intuitions and never mind what people say about it, never mind what the law says, but through this. Whereas the others, the rationalist and the natural law types in the 18th century, which is quite different from the natural law in the Middle Ages.
More like natural rights at that time, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly. They do go together, but even natural rights meant something else in the Middle Ages too. So there is a confusion of language here. But in any event, the natural law in the modern age is a rationalist concept in the first place. And the beautiful soul is the sentimental, we call it, that's not in a pejorative sense, but is the feeling intuition.
Right.
There is something in that idea, in both ideas, there is something that goes back to the ancients. Because for the Greeks, in Greek ethics, the notion of law is there, yes. Plato has written so much about these things that we cannot deny it. But the notion of law as an absolute command is not there. It is a question that is the very word for what is good in Greek. To kalon kagaton. The kalo kagaton. The beautiful good. The two are together. The elegant, I would say. And that we find also in people like Shaftesbury and the whole sentimental or feeling school, even in Hume, David Hume.
Now there is another tradition that goes throughout the Western Christian tradition, especially, of a mystical tradition that comes from the 8th century Syrian monks, thought to be Syrian monks, Pseudo-Dionysius or Dionysius yes. The Areopagite.
Yes.
And this is a tradition that goes in some sense beyond the idea of the individual, the created individual and the creator God, into a transcendent reality that precedes the appearance of creator created in the apophatic mysticism, in this unknowing. This is a tradition that also resurfaces regularly in the Western tradition in Meister Eckhart and Nicholas of Cusa. How does this tradition kind of soften the burden of the sense of necessity and, and mechanism of law of the Renaissance, perhaps? Or does it?
I would say this, that this movement has always remained a mystical movement, spiritual movement, in this sense that it has never, I think, as far as I know, really determined the scientific development of culture, and only slightly the philosophical ideas about God. In Thomas, for example, we find something of the negative theology, and in all Catholic theologians of that time you have that. And again later in the early Protestant ones too. In Luther, for example, very much. I think that there is no difference in this respect between Luther and the late medieval tradition, none whatsoever, in the respect of spirituality. But this spirituality is characterized by something that people do not sufficiently recognize, I'm afraid. The mystics use this ignorance, particularly when they indicate the closeness to God. In other words, the more close they feel themselves to God, the more they realize how far away from the Godhead they are, and the more they emphasize the negativity. Now, it's actually a little bit earlier, Pseudo-Dionysius, certainly not later than the 7th century, I think, but he is a mysterious person, and what he exactly meant, has been even a time that people kept wondering about the fact whether he was a Christian or not, because he at times in some of his works repeats Proclus, the late pagan philosopher, Neoplatonic philosopher, and it is a purely negative theology, which you have.
And by negative, it doesn't mean destructive. It means that it's a theology that does not depend upon clear positive analogies of God with the human characteristics, but speaks of God's unknowability.
Yes.
And comes from a tradition of the recognition of mind that is greater than the discursive mind, a kind of unifying intelligence in
But
mind.
there is an interesting thing here, that is that the negative theology did not originate in Christianity, but in Platonism.
Right.
The later, the post-Platonic philosophy of Platonism, after Plato himself, it was particularly in Plotinus and in Proclus, was a theology of negation. The ultimate has no name. Plotinus called it the one. And Proclus corrects that even to this Proclus, a disciple, indirect disciple of Plotinus, by saying that the one has nothing to do with calculation. It's just the name we give to it. So the negative theology was picked up by Christian thinkers, and the one you mentioned was a Neoplatonist, this Pseudo-Dionysius, and I would even say, as far as I know, that Christian mysticism as it actually exists would not be what it is without the late Platonic philosophers. The basic categories come from Plato, Plotinus, and Proclus.
And there are some interesting and strong threads of connection between Neoplatonism and the Oriental traditions, are there not? Some actual direct influences, possibly, between the religions of India and others in the Middle East and
With
these
India,
traditions?
I don't think there is any connection. I don't think so. I do agree that there is a negative theology there very much, but it develops in a completely different way. For example, with Indians, Vedanta particularly, the later, what we see is the multiplicity of gods is absolutely unimportant. We can accept atheism, theism, or polytheism. It doesn't matter that much, because the issue there is somewhere else. And it is also negative, you're right, but I don't think that the West had any influence upon this Indian theology of the Vedanta.
A matter of some debate, but not you, but you and you particularly don't see it. Now let me ask you about, you're working on, your next book is Romanticism, the Unfinished Revolution, and it seems that Romanticism represents an attempt to reclaim what many feel has been lost in the Enlightenment.
Yes.
But some have suggested that it's still bound to Enlightenment values and kind of held back by that.
Yes, you state in one sentence the whole complexity of the thesis. Romanticism is definitely a reaction against the rationalism of the Enlightenment. And specifically also in the religious matters. The Enlightenment people that we know of, the late Enlightenment, were actually anti-religious. They had ideas about God. There is a deism there in most of them, even in Voltaire, and one of the few who doesn't have it, I think, is Diderot at the end of his life. He was an atheist. And Dolbach, who was a disciple of Diderot. They were atheists, but atheism is not a problem of the 18th century. That's something of the 19th. What we had in the 18th century was a sort of vague deism, so vague, le Dieu gendarme, the God who is a policeman, you know. But beyond that, there is nothing that God does, of Voltaire.
He kicks things off and then disappears.
Yes. He says, here is the world, and he, as Pascal ridiculed the theory, which he felt already in Descartes, it is just as if God gives la première chicanaude, the first whip is his hand, and the world is on its own. It's gone. That's not the case. But in Romanticism, there is a reaction against this, partly a recovery of that beautiful soul thinking, and we say no. Religion is the expansion of the whole human being in the confrontation with the transcendence. But at the same time, it is, in another way, very much still in the inheritance of the 18th century. In this sense, that, to give a simple idea, the French Revolution is one of the wildest romantic things that ever happened. But the whole ideology comes out of the 18th century. Historians who lived shortly after the revolution have pointed out that paradox of the French Revolution, with such a romantic thing and such a, at the same time, such an extremely rationalistic affair. But that also means that the romantic philosophers, or thinkers, let us put it, and poets particularly. Poetry is the big thing in the romantic area, and art. That for the romantic artists and the romantic poets, most of them are thoroughly religious. Almost none of them is orthodox, because they feel there is another restriction, there is another form of rationalism. Even those who started as very conservative Catholic or Protestant thinkers developed far away from that. Like Lamartine, the French first great romantic poet in France, was a person who came from an extremely devout family and was also extremely devout, but gradually moved away from that. Victor Hugo, Christian family. In the United States, in England, in England, Wordsworth was very early in reaction against dogma, whereas he's a very religious poet. Shelley, the great atheist, was in fact also deep down, it's too long to prove that now, but was in many respects deeply religious, but very anti-Christian. yes, but deeply religious. Coleridge turned back to the Christian religion in his old age. And Keats is, again, pretty much a non-religious person in the sense, in the institutional sense. He reacted against that as much as Shelley. But in his poetry, if you analyze that, you see very much a sense of transcendence.
Some have said that the split between the Eastern and the Western Church left the Western Church poor because the dominant theology of the Roman Catholic Church came through the scholastics, through Aristotelianism, and that the Aristotelian doctrine of substance, that what makes a thing itself is that it's rooted in a substance, really meant that the divine and the human couldn't intermingle in the way that it could under Plato, where things that appeared were participatory representations or participated in the divine. Because of this doctrine of substance, that the Western Church suppressed a bodily esotericism that enabled man to have a bodily felt religious connection to the cosmos. And they point to, for example, there's much more of a tradition of even lay practitioners being able to have a divinized body, and that the prayer of the heart, the prayer of Eastern Orthodox spirituality, which involves the breath, involves invocation, is more of this Platonic participatory tradition, and therefore the kind of the esotericism of spirituality has had an impediment in the West. Is there any truth to that in your view?
I totally agree with that. Because the Eastern tradition is very much a mystical Christianity. A Christianity that was not afraid of the identification between God and the world, between God and man. Whereas the Western form of Christianity was, in the beginning, particularly in its Roman beginning, strongly influenced by Roman legalism. And later also by a certain rationalism. It is quite typical what happened with Romanticism. After the Romantics opened up the world, like Chateaubriand, for example, the great French writer, the first romantic prose writer in France, well, more or less, he opened up religion again to the people who had gone through the whole 18th century deism and to the revolution, the atheism of the revolution, and says, here is religion. Look how beautiful it is. It's a cultural element. And what is the reaction of the church? What was the reaction of the churches? But I'm most familiar with the Catholic Church. Instead of responding to that, instead of opening up to this movement, what we see is that is exactly the time when the church started withdrawing into itself. There were condemnations one after another. For example, that all power comes from the people, heresy. Free democracy is an ideal form, or at least the least bad form of government. All of that was rejected, and anything that was in line with this new movement was systematically rejected. The people were condemned left and right. What came instead? Instead came decrees about the infallibility of the Pope and things like that. It is declared by law.
An institutionalized authoritarian. Then also within that exclusion of man from his bodily awakening to the divine, that means that the figure of Jesus and also the possibility of new renewals of religion through new Christ or new God-men or God-women
Yes.
were also tabooed. So we Westerners have
Yes.
grown up with a strong taboo about meeting human beings to whom we can find the divine incarnate and respond to that one in a living way.
It's really a spirituality. It's changing now completely in the 20th century already, but and evermore that mystical Eastern element has been rediscovered of the Eastern Church. It is very much so. In fact, Episcopalianism is full of that orthodoxy. But be that as it may, the way of the East, I mean the way of Eastern Christianity then, is a possibility of, not only a possibility, but an imperative to become mystical, to merge with God. At the same time, negative theology. The more intimate, the stronger the feeling of obsession. Whereas in the West is I here and God there. And I find the way in which much of American evangelicism, both in the Protestant and the Catholic churches, is totally an oppositional religion. God has decided this and that. God has told me so and so. Well, that is not the way it was in the beginning, not even in the Roman Catholic Church. There is there a deviation to an ever more substantialism, almost not in the lived piety, of course, that is always okay, but in the doctrine often it resembles a materialism of religion.
And so it's profoundly suppressive, really, of the human's native aspiration to be united with the one which already exists, and you intuit. So
Yes.
It must create a tremendous pain of
They're willing to
self-division.
call God everything. They're willing to call God the one. I mean, it doesn't make any difference until it comes to the relation between the world and me. And what is typical, that strikes me as someone who is born in another culture, what strikes me, or what struck me in the beginning, now I'm used to it, is that this world, this Anglo-Saxon world, here more than in England, because it's simplified here, is a world in which God is almighty and can interfere in a bad way if he wants to. But this is our world, and in which we can reach the maximum of technology and leave us alone. You see what I mean?
Yes. What do you see as the spiritual crisis of contemporary men and women, and where do you think we're at? What do you think are the prospects for our time? Do we need a spiritual renewal to survive? And if so, how would it come about?
I think the question is actually more acute in Europe than it is here. The part of the world where I am from, anything that speaks Netherlandish, so Holland, Flanders, where I'm from, and anything that speaks French, these two cultures, they have been profoundly secularized. Of course, in England even more, but that not even more at this point, because there is a steep drop in religion in the Dutch-speaking countries. Since I was in both of them, I know it. And there, the renewal is happening in a very strange and unexpected form, namely as a reaction. People feel, the ones who are still believers, feel very strongly that they really have to mean it if they're going to be religious. So the happy, lackluster Catholic of my youth, or Protestant, that says, no, I'm from here, so I'm a Catholic, or I'm from there and I'm a Protestant, that is finished. You just have to be convinced. But I think, and this is the direct response to your question, that more is needed than a reaction here, because if you have a reaction, you're going to have a conservatism very often and say, let's go back to the old church. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. We live in a different culture. It is precisely this difference that has driven me to write books about culture when I was professor of religious philosophy. So I said, there is the issue, the break, the difference. But that's why I think that we need something more, namely a renewal of spirituality, and I fully agree with you.
The late German philosopher Martin Heidegger said, "Only a God can save us now."
Yes, but that was set in a context, and yes,
But in the context of going on the representational mind and the whole technological mindset.
Yeah.
So do you
And
think that modern men and
yes.
women
Yes.
are ready for a revelation, a sensible one that actually impacts?
There is a great anxiousness, not anxiety, but anxiousness to have something spiritual, even to the point that we have now godless or atheistic even spiritualities because people feel we have something. There is also an enormous increase of superstition.
Yes.
And all of that, the witchcraft, and just name it, all these things are reveal a particular aspiration towards a spiritual life, something that is totally empty, something that is totally missing in our culture. I think, though, that theology, being what it is, or what it has become, and it's changing, but still being what it is, that the renewal has to come from below. That means from the poets. I find poetry has been for me lately the great inspiration for religious renewal. Not just the Christian poets, that's not the issue. The poets who say, look, this is not enough, there is something more to life than our material or technological well-being. There is no poet who has impressed me most as a religious poet than the German romantic poet Hölderlin. And particularly at the moment when he was falling apart, he became insane. He was for 30 years completely insane. But at that moment there, he wrote poetry that is so stunningly beautiful, his odes and his hymns, and so thoroughly sad about the loss of God in this life, in this culture, in this life in which we live. And he was not a particularly Christian poet at all, because he goes back to the ancients and he says, but to the Greeks, and he says, what has happened to the beautiful gods? What has happened? Why have they left us?
The shining gods.
The absence of God.
Louis Dupré, I want to thank you so much for speaking with Dharma Cafe.
Thank you. My pleasure.